But I think there's some value in trying to step back and take a general overview, like isolate the important issues, focus on the important overarching issues. So let's start with a very broad question, which maybe even sounds too broad, right? The question is, what does political philosophy study? And what the hell are we doing here, right? What is the subject, political philosophy? And there are many ways to define this. My preferred way of defining political philosophy is seeing political philosophy as a continuation of moral philosophy with the question of good, of the good, at the center of political philosophy, right? So, moral or political philosophy or political theory asks the question as to what is the good. What do we mean by the word good? So morality, maybe slightly more with an emphasis on the individual, and political philosophy slightly maybe with a more emphasis on the collective good or common good, right? But this is a deeply important question in many ways, right? And our science, political science, political theory, has potentially two starting points. The starting point in this course for us is Thomas Hobbes, and more specifically the scientific revolution. Before Hobbes, there was, of course, Machiavelli and several other lesser-known figures. But still, so we can trace the start of our discipline to the scientific revolution and Thomas Hobbes. We could also go back to the ancient Greeks and start with Socrates, which is a valid starting point as well. But obviously, we don't pay as much attention to it in our course. So again, let me write Socrates in brackets as the starting point of our subject of our discipline, and Hobbes and the scientific revolution as a more immediate starting point. Now, what is the main thrust? How does political philosophy begin, or moral philosophy in general? How does it begin? Well, we need to start with a very important contrast, which we talked about last year, which goes back to the Greeks, and it goes back to the Greeks, but it's very much relevant to the discipline that we are studying here, right? And this is the contrast between the way people live their lives and the best way. So what people actually think and what we think is the normative ideal. Let me rephrase that maybe in a slightly more clear sense, right? So when Socrates begins to philosophize, Socrates has this notion that Athenians go about their daily lives without ever asking themselves the question as to what they are doing with their lives and why they are doing it. It's kind of unreflective acceptance of tradition. Unreflective acceptance of tradition. Let's write this. Unreflective acceptance of tradition. Right? And as opposed to that, Socrates asks this very important but also very challenging question, for which he is executed by the city of Athens on the charge of treason. He asks, but what is actually good? How do we define the good? And in many ways, just to ask this question, especially in the ancient context, but in modern context as well, it seems to be deeply subversive, right? Again, this is the profound danger of doing political philosophy. It's inherent danger to the philosopher, if you want, right? Because, again, the ordinary notion of human decency, again, this unreflective acceptance of tradition, demands that certain questions just not be asked. Again, the kind of example we've talked over and over about in the last year, right? This idea of what is good? Some people plant flowers, some people eat children. What is good? So, again, to the person in the street, elicits laughter because it does sound maybe like a joke, maybe even a cruel joke, right? But to a person in the street, there's no question. What's wrong with you? What's the matter with you? Are you sick? What kind of strange thoughts are you having if you're even asking these kinds of questions? And again, obviously the Athenian situation was difficult and complex in all sorts of ways, But there is an essence in which Socrates was executed by the city of Athens precisely because he asked that kind of question. How do we know what is the good? So it's an important question, but it's also a dangerous question. So as opposed to this unreflective, so again, it goes back to Socrates, but again, you're not writing about Socrates. Let's fast forward to Hobbes. And let me say the following thing. So during the scientific revolution, so as opposed to this uncritical acceptance of tradition, what we want is a theory, a well-grounded rational theory. Let me just write rational theory. There is some beginning of rational theory in Socrates and in Plato, but let's get to Hobbes. Let's talk about Hobbes. So in the scientific revolution, in general, there was this notion that the ancients had certain insights and intuitions. So you had these, so unreflective acceptance of tradition, again, this ancient insights and intuitions. About how the world works. For example, that the earth is at the center of the world, of the entire universe, right? Certain ideas about physics, biology, maybe even certain ideas about mathematics and geometry, right? So the ancients had certain insights and intuitions, but most of these insights and intuitions were not well grounded, and very often people were wrong. So we have an intuition that the earth is stationary, but actually the earth is moving, right? Or we have an intuition that the earth is flat, but actually the earth is round. So the basic intuitions need to be, if you want, enlightened, made more sophisticated by critical rational theory. So this is, critical of tradition, and in this sense, to some extent, subversive, right? And notice, the ancients, especially in works of, let's say, Aristotle, had this idea of natural hierarchy of value in the universe. The world, for Aristotle, was a deeply orderly place. And in this deeply orderly place, so maybe let me continue here, right? So for Aristotle, let's say Aristotle and let's say Hobbes. But it's going to be true for other philosophers in our course as well. So for Aristotle, Aristotle uses the word telos, which means aim or purpose or goal. This universe is harmonious. There's an, again, order of value inherent in nature. There are capital V values, and capital P purposes, natural purposes, right? So among other things, Aristotle is going to say human beings have a purpose, and the purpose of the human being is the purpose of human life is to exercise our highest faculties. Again, you have this natural hierarchy implicit in all of this. Again, the exercise of our highest faculties. And again, so like we don't tend to believe in this today, right? What is human highest faculty? Who's going to decide, right? But this was Aristotelian notion, right? And then in people like beginning with somebody like Hobbes, so as opposed to this natural universe with laws of hierarchy, you get the beginning of the physical science, and the physical science says no, there is no purpose. There's only blind mechanistic causation. So as opposed to this telos, on this side, we have this blind mechanism, right? So you can think of Newton is writing after Hobbes, but still, this idea that F is equal to m1 multiplied by m2 multiplied by the constant g divided by r squared, right? This formula doesn't care about your beliefs, desires, your values, or your happiness or unhappiness. And from the standpoint of this formula, again, everything, and for Hobbes it's true, the world is just chaos of matter in motion. And when we talk about this chaos of matter and motion, it means that it's devoid of intrinsic value. This is the cash value of the state of Hobbes' statement that the world is chaos of matter and motion. Nothing is good or evil in and of itself. Again, one person plants flowers, the other person eats children. It's just, law of universal attraction. And the same way that in physics, we talk about attraction and repulsion, for example, gravitational attraction or electromagnetic repulsion, in a similar fashion, now, in political theory, and Hobbes in many ways is the founder of political theory, we will talk about aversions and desires, right? And again, so this very important phrase, again, Kant, you will remember, some of you will remember, calls this the abyss of purposeless chaos of matter. Kant doesn't like this idea. The abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. And Hobbes seems to embrace this abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. And again, Hobbes says a very important phrase: whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire is what man calls good, and the object of man's hate and aversion is what man calls evil. There being nothing simply and absolutely so. Nothing in and of itself is absolutely good or absolutely evil. So in many ways, those of you who are maybe more interested in philosophy in a deeper sense, so again, so here we have telos and harmony, here we have blind mechanism and chaos, right? And here we had capital V values, here we have small v values and small p purposes, right? And maybe even in the plural, but not capital V, not capital P. You understand the difference, right? So Aristotle is going to say something is objectively good, and Hobbes is going to say, no, people just do whatever they like. Something's good for me, something's good for you, but nothing is good in and of itself. We don't have values with capital V, we have with capital V, we simply have subjective values. And you see, Hobbes is going to say, it's like, what kind of proof can you have of this kind of doctrine? And this is where I want to move from Hobbes to Mill. So, who's also on this side of the board? Who talks about this chaos and these lack of values and purposes? So I was actually going to mention something. Another great philosopher whom we do not study in this course, Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, right? So this is the death of God, the revaluation of all values in Hobbes in anticipation of Nietzsche. Hobbes maybe says that God is incomprehensible, so maybe he believes in God, but an incomprehensible God is just as good as a dead God. So in a practical sense, God is dead for Hobbes just as well as God is dead for Nietzsche, right? But it's very important again that this anti-moral and anti-teleological stance, Again, I remind you, telos means aim or purpose or goal. We see this in Hobbes, yes. But very importantly, we then see this in Rousseau. And we will see this in John Stuart Mill. And I would say, but let's be careful, with a question mark, in Marx. So for Hobbes, Rousseau, Mill, and Marx, there is no intrinsic order of value in nature. Mill tackles this question head on. But I feel that all four philosophers are in agreement on this issue. So I'm not talking just about Hobbes. I'm talking about all of them at the same time. Right? So what Mill is going to say is, look, I wake up in the morning and I ask myself, what should I do? So it's a pretty important question. Most of the time, people just simply unreflectively follow the customs and habits of tradition without actually thinking about their lives. And Socrates is going to come and say, that's not a life worthy of a human being. This is a very important question which you should ask. Unless you ask this question, you might as well be dead. It's not your life that you are living, right? So value of autonomy, importance of autonomy. We're going to need to talk about autonomy in a moment, right? But Mill is saying, what should I do? I wake up in the morning, in this Heideggerian fashion, I find myself thrown into this world without a manual. I have no idea. There is no clear notion of what I should do. If I try to find like a geometric proof of what is value, what is it that I objectively should do, I cannot find this kind of derivation. People can write books about this. There are holy books. There are prophets who pretend to speak in God's name. But how do I know? How can I trust the prophets? There are many prophets, they disagree, and as Hobbes says, prophets are humans and humans can lie. Is there a reason why I should trust prophetic revelation, right? So basically, I think that for all these philosophers, the argument is in the negative. We, go back to the ancient skeptics, people like Sextus Empiricus, we do not know what is good. This knowledge is unavailable to us. We don't know. As humans, we don't know what is good. So, and we cannot know. We cannot find. Again, Socrates says, I know that I know nothing. He who, like Socrates, is wise, who knows that ultimately human intellect is limited. So maybe something is good in and of itself, but we have no access to that. So we have to do the second best thing. And the second best thing, Mill says, is like the only proof that an object is visible is that people see it. The only proof that the object is audible is that people hear it. This is like, can you imagine that something is visible but nobody sees it? Well, maybe theoretically, but we don't have any access to that. Our only access to objects visible is through our vision. Right? Unless we don't see it, it's like if you say that there's an invisible unicorn right here in this room, how can I be sure? How can I know? Maybe you're lying to me. Maybe you're being misled. Maybe we're being misled. It could be that there's an invisible unicorn. It could be, but I need to have a reason to believe that. Mm-hmm. So I want to say, Mill says that basically, we don't have these we don't have these capital V values, only small v values. But the small v values are that when I wake up in the morning, I find myself with desires and aversions. Let's say I wake up in the morning and I want to drink a glass of water. I want to drink a glass of water naturally. Again, it's like planting flowers, eating children. Think of a lion who eats zebra's children. Is lion being evil? Hobbes would say no. It's just an order of nature. A lion is like a mechanical clock. Within the mechanical clock, there's a spring. The spring unwinds, and the animal moves. And the spring is the Latin word conatus. Again, desires and aversions, right? So the lion naturally wants to eat the zebra, and that's what the lion will do. Does it mean it's good? Well, it's not good, not bad. It's natural. In the same fashion, I wake up in the morning, I want to drink a glass of water. Is that good? I don't know. I have no idea, but it's natural. And for me, I could try to resist the temptation, the desire to drink water, but there has to be a reason for me to resist that, right? So let's say if I believe in some sort of holy book that tells me that I should not drink, let's say, until noon, then maybe, okay, if I believe that there's a good reason, okay, I will stop myself from drinking water. But in general, Mill says we don't have books like that. All of these arguments are full of holes. So at the end of the day, we are left, again, in this Nietzschean proto-existentialist fashion. We have to throw our hands up in the air and say, yes, human life is meaningless, so I'm going to gratify my desires because what else can I do? Nothing else seems to matter. Again, Nietzsche, I think, phrases this best. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, and again, I'm talking about Nietzsche, but this is relevant to Hobbes, to Rousseau, to Mill, and I would say to Marx as well. We'll talk about Locke and Hegel in a second, right? So Nietzsche says, what matters in Zarathustra? He says, what matters my happiness? What matters my happiness? What is the value of my happiness? And Nietzsche says, it is poverty and filth and wretched contentment. It's poverty and filth and wretched contentment. It doesn't matter at all. It's not valuable in any sense, my happiness. It's just a petty subjective thing. Okay, what gives me pleasure? But then Nietzsche, again, in this sense that God is dead, nothing is valuable. He says, but it is my happiness that ought to justify existence itself. So I think in German it's Dasein selbst rechtfertigen. It is my happiness that ought to justify existence itself. Because it's a good justification? No, but because nothing else can justify existence, right? So it's a very dramatic phrase. And I think that Hobbes and Rousseau and Mill and Marx are on board with this picture. So basically, what we are left with, standing at the end of the day, is that, again, we don't have this capital V values, capital P purposes, but what we have, the only way that we can define good is just subjectively what feels good. Some sort of subjective measure of happiness. Mm-hmm. So I have this, my individual subjective feeling of good, and then collectively we have common interest. Common interest. And again, and notice, right? Hobbes is going to say, and I mean, let's talk about this. For the ancients, especially in terms of religious philosophy, you had this notion of unconditional moral duty, unconditional obedience, and the notion again of duties coming before rights. So unfortunately, I did not leave myself. Okay, maybe I can write here, right? So let's try to define this. Okay. So let's say in people like, well, let's just get some name on the board. Let's say Augustine, right? And on this side of the board, let's have Hobbes, right? Augustine is going to say you have unconditional moral obligations. Unconditional moral obligations. Right? And also, in addition to that, you have duties. And your duties are more important than your rights. Okay, so, and when I talk about Augustine, also maybe immediately, let's, with a question mark, let's talk about Locke, and let's talk about Kant, Immanuel Kant, because they kind of, again, notice, I did not write names of Locke and Kant, I mean, we're not talking about Kant. And Hegel is complicated. We'll get to Hegel in a moment, but it's important. We're going to need to get to Hegel, right? Duties are more important than rights. Human beings are born, again, Augustine would say, we are born God's slaves. We belong to God. We are sent into this world, in words of John Locke, about God's business, and we have to follow God's law. We have this unconditional duty before God to do certain things, right? And Hobbes, in this, again, proto-Nietzschean fashion, is going to say, God is incomprehensible. I have no idea what my purposes are. Again, and it's again, thrown into this world without a manual, what can I do? The only thing I can do is gratify my desires, right? So Hobbes is going to say, any kind of obligation or duty has to be conditional. There needs to be conditions. Conditions of obedience, always. And therefore, also limits of obedience. Limits of obedience. Whereas for Augustine, let's say, obedience is often or could be unlimited. And I'll give you an example in a second, right? Conditional obedience, limits of obedience. And again, here, duties are more important than rights. Here, very importantly, no, for Hobbes, rights are more important than duties. But when Hobbes says this, again, we have the right of nature, which is the right to all things, right? The right to all things. But the fact that everybody has a right to all things means that nobody has a right to nothing. Again, this is Nietzsche before Nietzsche. There is no such thing as morality. Nothing is good or evil. In this kind of in the state of nature, might makes right. Nothing is good or evil in and of itself. This is again. This is Hobbes writing Nietzsche before Nietzsche. And again, if you think of Rousseau, the way that Rousseau paints the state of nature in the second discourse, Rousseau says very similar things. Again, he says, I find in any animal simply an ingenious machine which winds itself up. This is what Rousseau says. Rousseau would kind of, again, be on board with this picture. And again, John Stuart Mill would also be on board with this picture. John Stuart Mill very famously attacks the notion of natural rights precisely because, again, you see, this is a skeptical argument. This is a skeptical argument in the negative. It's not like you can prove that there's no such thing as natural rights. It's not that you can prove a negative, right? But you say, show me natural rights. What are the natural rights? Can you give me a demonstration? Can we agree on what the natural rights are? Can the United Nations agree on what the natural rights are? When there was genocide in Rwanda, where was the world community with its natural rights? I mean, so many people, billions of people right now, this moment, are starving in the world. Their lives are in danger. Where are natural rights? Who will exercise, who will enforce the natural rights? Covenants without the swords are but word, Hobbes would say. Right? So anyway, so there are conditions of obedience and there's limits of obedience. So Hobbes, so let's do this briefly. Let's go step by step. Hobbes is going to say, obedience is legitimate when it is in your interest, right? This is a very important thought. In many ways, maybe this is the most important thought of all political philosophy that we are studying. Right? Human beings are born free in this amoral universe for these thinkers. And this is why we can only be obliged with our own consent. So again, Rousseau says this, in this form of association, right? Where man is born free, everywhere he's in chains, right? We need to find a form of association by means of which each unites with all, but nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. Would Hobbes agree with this? Yes, Hobbes would agree with this. Because notice, conditions of obedience, but also limits of obedience. What would Hobbes say? You obey the sovereign because it is your free choice. This is the metaphor of the social contract. You obey the sovereign because it is in your interest. You obey the sovereign because your life is protected by the sovereign. And if the sovereign does not protect you, then the contract is void. So condition of obedience, you obey when it's in your interest, you're being protected. Limits of obedience, the contract is void and you are no longer obliged. Compare this to Augustine, compare this to Kant. Augustine says, if the emperor is trying to kill you, you die, martyr's death, смерть мученика. Because all power comes from God. There is no right of resistance. There are no limits of obedience. Kant would say exactly the same thing. This is a big difference between political philosophy of Kant and political philosophy of Hobbes. Kant basically says, yes, the moral law demands that we always obey earthly authority, and if the earthly authority is forcing you to do something which is against your conscience, which is maybe against your religion or against morality, then the only thing you can do is passive, non-violent resistance, and you accept your punishment, which may be imprisonment or death. You see the radicalism of Locke and Kant. And Hobbes is going to say that he is charting a middle road. And in fact, Hobbes, I think, and Rousseau and Mill, Marx, always with a question mark, let's not talk about Marx, but for Hobbes, Rousseau, and Mill, this is the task of political philosophy is to find a sweet spot, a balance between too much liberty and too much authority. Right? So what do we mean specifically? Again, too much liberty. If people disobey too much, society collapses. Too much authority, there are limits of obedience. Some things you should never do, right? So again, for Hobbes, it's again, Leviathan protects you, or if Leviathan does not protect you, the contract is void. For Rousseau, the true social contract is the only legitimate grounds of obedience. He says, outside of the true social contract, people can be forced to obey as slaves, but there is no legitimacy behind slavery. Might makes right. And the slaves, as soon as they can, will try to escape, right? Mill, similarly, right, talks about how we have all sorts of, again, insights and traditions, but only those insights are good, only those traditions are good, which increase, again, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But I want you to see, in Hobbes, protection, in Rousseau, also, again, protection and social harmony, that kind of thing, and in Mill, greatest happiness of the greatest number, all of them, Rousseau and Hobbes and Mill, are talking about common interest. So broadly speaking, I think that there's a very important utilitarian element in all these philosophers. In fact, again, so Hobbes is very straightforwardly a proto-utilitarian thinker. The legitimacy of the government has to be derived from the consent of the governed. The legitimacy of the government has to be derived from the consent of the governed. For Hobbes, Rousseau, Mill, and I would say Marx as well, right? And no free person can be forced to obey unless they freely consent to obedience, right? So I consent to obey conditionally because I get something out of obedience. Obedience is in my interest, right? Rousseau, so Hobbes is a fairly straightforward proto-utilitarian. Rousseau uses the word utility. He says in the beginning of the social contract, some of you will start reading this book soon, he talks about how in this book, Rousseau says, I will try to unite what right permits with what interest prescribes. What right permits with what interest prescribes, so that justice and utility will not be separated. Actually, Rousseau uses the word utilité in French. He uses the word utility. So on this notion, for these philosophers, there's no such thing as justice with capital J. So no capital J justice. But we have small j justice, capital J. Small j justice. Right? And the small j justice is simply common interest. Justice is simply common interest. Obeying, for Hobbes, obeying the sovereign is justice because it's in the common interest of security. Obeying the sovereign, for Rousseau, injustice because it's in the common interest of us enjoying the benefits of the true social contract. And very obviously, Mill spends a whole chapter, chapter 5 of Utilitarianism, a very important chapter on justice, where basically this is what he says. Justice simply concerns the most vital portion, the most important portion of our common interest. Right? And so I hope this makes some sense. I hope this is also kind of, I don't know, stimulating in many ways. I hope you can see these parallels. When we talk about Marx, you see, why Marx with a question mark? Because Marx is a complicated philosopher. And what is Marx's morality? It's hard to say exactly. Marx doesn't have a full-fledged theory of morality. But Marx says a couple things. First of all, he says that communism is a state in which, is a condition, social condition, in which the free development of each enables the free development of all. Free development of each and the free development of all in this positive feedback loop. So, but what does it mean, free development of each, and to what end, for what ground, right? Another thing that Marx also says is that in communism there will be no difference between egoism and altruism, no difference between egoism and altruism, right? So when I read these, so basically you do what's good for you, but it's also good for society at the same time. A gist of this idea is present already in Adam Smith. Adam Smith talks about this in The Invisible Hand of the Market. Everybody does selfishly what's good for them, but the result is general good for all society. And Marx says it's not happening in capitalism. Adam Smith describes something, but he's not describing actual capitalism, because in the actual capitalism, according to Marx, rich get richer, poor get poorer. But there's a possibility to get into this stage of well-ordered society in which there will be no difference between egoism and altruism. And in many ways, maybe this is the ultimate upshot of political philosophy that we are talking about. Again, this constellation of several ideas, right? The idea of freedom, and specifically of free obedience. But free obedience is possible only if it is in your interest to obey. So free obedience, only if it's in your interest to obey, your interest, your individual interest. But notice, then society is possible only if it is in everybody's individual interest to obey. And what do you call this? Everybody's individual interest. You call this common interest. So free obedience, individual interest, therefore, we're talking about common interest. Common interest is the ground of legitimacy. And all of this relies on a super important assumption that human beings have a kind of a nature. Every philosopher in our course makes strong, important assumptions about human nature, right? And more specifically, the assumption that human nature is such that we are enabled by each other. Society sometimes restricts us, but much more importantly, society has the capacity to enable us. So I could write, harmony of interest between individual and society. This is an assumption about human nature. And again, if you want a quote in the words of Marx, he talks about how the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And I suppose the free development of all also then a condition for the free development of each, right? So, and this is the promise of political philosophy in all the thinkers. Okay, let me add, at least tentatively. Let's talk about, because Locke and Hegel are missing from this picture. So I want to say that in addition to all this, I feel that Hegel and Locke, and this could remind you of the Taylor-Warrender thesis, Hegel and Locke are going to say, yes, you care about yourself. Yes, you protect your self-interest, but not only because it's in your self-interest, but also because you have a duty. Again, Locke is going to say you have a duty to God, duty to protect yourself. So it's not just your right, but also your duty to protect yourself. So even though Locke has a different foundation, the conclusion is going to be the same. We freely obey because it's in our interest. Society is legitimate only if it's in your interest. Locke says this quite explicitly, that all legitimate political authority has to be aimed at the public good. Even the prerogative power, some of you will remember this in Locke, has to be aimed at the public good. Salus populi suprema lex, it's a quote from Cicero. The health of the people is the highest law. And when we talk about harmony of individual society, right, so in addition to these historically contingent assumptions, because how does Hobbes know that there's a possibility of this harmony? Well, we don't know. Let's look outside the window. Let's do an empirical study, right? In addition to those empirical assumptions, for Locke, there's also a theological assumption that God has made the world a harmonious place such that, at the end of the day, interests of individual and society coincide also because the universe is harmonious. Now, when we get to Hegel, Hegel is a very complicated philosophy, has a complicated theology, and I would encourage you to start with a completely secular interpretation of Hegel. And as a first pass, I think completely secular interpretation of Hegel is good. It does its job well. And basically what Hegel is saying is, against Kant, Kant had this notion that you have to choose. Either be moral or do what you like. Kant says these two are mutually exclusive. Notice, this is very different from what we have on the board. Nobody on the board agrees with Kant. Kant has this idea that in order to be moral, you have to disregard all considerations of your own personal happiness, right? And Hegel's basic answer to this is no. In the end of history, in the Rechtsstaat, at the end of history, we want to achieve this harmony. Again, this subjective, the harmony of the subjective and the objective. So Hegel is going to say, yes, maybe you have duties, maybe you have objective, unconditional duties, but still, you only, in the end of history, you only fulfill those objective, unconditional duties because you subjectively and freely choose to obey. Very important unity of the subjective and the objective. Hegel is going to say how in the ancient history, in the ancient past, ancient despotisms, people were forced to obey the subjection of the individual to the community, but there's nothing good about that. Maybe it was necessary for that stage of history, but there's nothing good about that. So what is kind of the end point, the end game of Hegel's political philosophy is this state of freedom, where people obey, yet obey freely. Again, this is a very important Rousseauian element in Hegel. So notice, kind of, these philosophers have their differences. I tried to concentrate mostly on what they have in common today, right? So basically, I hope you can see how we can broadly speaking add Locke and Hegel to this picture with some caveats. Now, I should also at least point in one sentence sort of a challenge to this point of view, right? Is it actually true? Is it actually true? Well, again, you will remember last year, well, we need to talk about possibility of progress. Yeah, we'll talk about possibility of progress in a second, right, as an answer to this, right? So last year, we began our course with the sophists, especially with people such as Callicles and Thrasymachus. And Callicles and Thrasymachus issue a radical challenge to this picture. They say, there's no such thing as justice. There's no such thing as justice. Justice is a lie that the strong tell to the weak to keep them pacified. Justice is a lie that the strong tell to the weak to keep them pacified. Well, could it be the case, right? And so let's say, let me write on the board 3 words. Conservatism, with a question, all 3 with a question mark. Conservatism, reform, revolution. Conservatism, question mark, reform, question mark, revolution. And more specifically, so could, let's say justice as false ideology, right? And you don't really get this in Hobbes, because Hobbes just says, come on, are you being protected? If you're being protected, then you're good. You should obey. But in all the other philosophers, so in people like Rousseau, right? Rousseau will talk about this. Now, not all societies are legitimate. So Rousseau will partially agree with Callicles and Thrasymachus. In the evil contract, there is no justice. There is no common interest. The strong force the weak to obey. Or let's say the ruling party, the ruling class forces everybody else to obey. There's no legitimacy in this society. So this is an important reformist or maybe revolutionary element in Rousseau. So similarly, there is this reformist or revolutionary element in Mill. Mill is going to say, look, societies have all sorts of laws. Some of them are plain bad. We need to put the science of politics on a firm foundation, and we need reform. Not necessarily revolution, but at least reform. Mill is writing to his fellow citizens. He's trying to persuade them through democratic means to change the constitution, to change the laws, right? To make the laws more rational in everybody's interest, right? So, so Rousseau, Mill, Hegel, obviously, Hegel is going to say, in ancient Greece, let's say, the Athenians killed Socrates. And it is a necessary thing, but it's also a horrible thing. It's a terrible thing. And Hegel is going to say how history gradually evolves. So there's place for revolution in Hegel. Hegel thinks that the French Revolution played an important part. But at the end of the day, Hegel is more of a conservative than a revolutionary. Sometimes revolutions are called for, but most of the time we want gradual organic development, right? And obviously Marx is going to talk about these issues at the same time, right? But, Marx is the revolutionary philosopher par excellence in this course, right? But you could say, how do we get there? How do we get there? Hobbes will begin with this bleak picture. Hobbes is going to say, society ultimately is based on violence. So, slavery through violence. And this is the basis of all societies. And again, I want to get to this class. I don't have a lot of time, but this class, you and me, colleagues in this class, is it the case that you are here because you are forced to be here? We're all born young and powerless. And society can take advantage of us. Society can do violence to us, can coerce us. Our parents can beat us up while we're young and force us to do things against our will. Are you here because you're forced to be here? Could it be that 20 years from now you wake up in cold sweat remembering the horrible suffering you went through in this class? Or, again, is there a possibility of progress? What is the possibility of progress? Well, this is the promise that freedom actually leads to efficiency. Freedom actually leads to efficiency. And this is a terrible question to ask, dangerous question to ask. Does it really lead to efficiency? Does freedom lead to efficiency? Because even Hobbes is going to say, remember, good laws, just laws. It is in the interest of the Leviathan that the subjects are strong. The subjects, again, this idea of transparency and accountability, even in Hobbes' Leviathan. Hobbes' limited defense of constitutionalism, limited defense of democracy, right? This idea that if the Leviathan makes the laws in the interest of the people, they will, they will understand that it's in their interest. They will obey automatically. Your society will be stronger. So basically, wars and threat of war between the sovereigns will force society to evolve. We have this idea in Hobbes. We also then have this idea in Hegel. Hegel says war is the driving force of history. The weak states, the bad states, the states which do not allow the individuals free expression of their creative potential, they fall by the wayside. They get conquered. And likewise, of course, Marx is going to talk about communism being a more efficient society, but also being a freer society. And I want to say, Marx has his reasons. Freer society. Marx has his reasons, but you have to ask this question. Could it be that maybe we have to choose between humanism and efficiency? Could it be that actually the most efficient social arrangement is anti-humanistic? It's a dangerous possibility. But again, this class serves as an example, maybe. This class serves as an example, as a paradigmatic example for the political philosophy, a class in political philosophy, paradigmatic example of what these thinkers are trying to do. So with a question mark, on the University of London, take everything with a grain of salt. But what are these thinkers trying to say? Look, what we are doing here, we are doing the most important thing that humans can do. We are engaged in pursuit of knowledge. Mill says the most important well-being of human beings is mental well-being. Through knowledge is power. Through knowledge, we conquer nature, but we also understand the laws of society, and we can reshape the laws of society in a more rational, in a better fashion, right? And so the idea is that in order for you to learn from me, I need to allow you freedom. But also, hopefully, in this class, I need to have an opportunity to learn from you and to double-check my ideas against your ideas. I am telling you about Hobbes. How do I know that my description of Hobbes is right unless I allow you to challenge my description? And in fact, this is hopefully how I progress. You alert my attention to certain passages in the reading which maybe don't jive well, right? And so, in general, this idea, we talk about, how society, common interest, everybody's enabling us, right? So this is the paradigm. Is it true? We don't know. That's the dangerous question. But this is the paradigm. Only, again, Mill thematizes this very much about free speech. If you have a dictatorship and ministry of truth, you don't know anything. You're a dictator, and your ministry of truth tells you that your country is the best country of the world. Is it true, or are they just lying to you? How can you double check? The only way you can double check is by allowing free and equal discussion. And again, the free and equal discussion hopefully allows for the possibility of progress, for us to rise up from this condition of slavery towards greater efficiency through freedom. How this idea how serfs, because they're freer, are more efficient than slaves, and free peasants are more efficient than serfs, right? So this idea of this kind of ultimate harmony between the interest of individual and interest of society. So last sentence. We have this rosy picture. We have this wonderful vision of harmony at the end of history. And you have to ask two questions. Is it possible? Is it possible at all? And the second question, if it's possible, are we there yet? And to what extent are we there? To what extent are we moving in that direction? Some philosophers, like, I don't know, Fukuyama, for example, would be tempted to say, oh, yes, we're already almost there, or completely there. But some philosophers like Marx are going to say no, or Rousseau are going to say no. The vast majority of people alive on planet Earth today do not live in well-ordered societies, right? And so this, hopefully, with this idea of the promise, but also the danger and the challenge of political philosophy, I'm going to leave you. I hope this was stimulating. I hope you found this fun. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you so much, colleagues, and I'll see you, I guess, on Thursday. Thank you.